Okay, so we only have one more unit to go after this one. As I mentioned to the class earlier, after Thanksgiving, when you come back, I'm gonna make it optional attendance. I will, before we go for Thanksgiving, I will give you your USB for your project. When you're done with the USB, just bring it back to me or bring it back to me at the end of the semester. I will be here for the class session for week 14 and 15. But I won't require you to come to class. I want you to spend that time to work on your project. So if you want to come to class to work on your project, that will probably be good for you. In the case that you have access to me, I will not give you the answer for your project, right? Your project will be graded on what you can find. You will need to supply the information and you will need to write up a formal report. So a formal report is what we're going to talk about today. So in chapter 10, it only talks about how we're going to be able to approach investigation reporting. I did put some templates on your assignment page, but you can also find templates on your project as well. Now you're going to see templates are going to be different across, but we want to convey the details that's going to be included in this unit. So at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about what you want to include on your report. I think Forensic Toolkit is really good at giving you what you need. You just need to take the data and interpret it. And that's what reporting really means. And this is when your expertise is going to come in, because everybody can use the software to kind of screenshot. But what you are seeing and what you are putting together for the case is important, right? So you kind of need to know where to find the information and what that will look like. Okay, so these 4 bullets are the things I'm going to look for on your project, and this is what you should include on your forensic investigation report. You always want to have the element to describe of the things that you have done. Okay, screenshots are important and how you did it. Okay, so what did you do, right? What tools that you used to do it, and what did you see? And it's important that you take notes all the way through because it's going to help you put together your report. I normally have a working document. So as I do it, I clip the screenshot, I add it, and I would put down like a few lines of notes. I can always expand on it later. So you need to state what you did, how you did it, and what did you find. Okay? So that means that we need to include from the time that you are acquiring the case or you notify of the case until all your digital evidence is being gathered, right? Now, the main thing that we also want to include is your actions is really going to be contributing to the information, just like what you did in the lab today. You want to find these things. I already created the questions for you, or the questions, some of the questions came from the case. But what you need to do is to think about like what you're trying to answer for the case. Because sometimes they just give you the case and they tell you, oh, just find out as much information as possible on this case. So you kind of have to see like what kind of question you want to answer, what kind of evidence that's going to help you answer those questions. So number one is going to be your target, which is going to be either the suspect, right? Or the victim, or both. Okay. So you have to answer the question, who are these people, right? What happened to them, right? What did they do? Especially from a digital forensic perspective, a lot of the things that we do, we can find the activities that they are committed to, web searches, files that they download and use, locations, right? So that's important to think about when you put together your report. So for number one, it asks you, why is note-taking important in digital forensic reporting? Because it's going to give you the details about the investigation and you can use it for your report. From my perspective and my experience, this is always useful. The more detailed you are on your notes, the easier it is for you to follow back. Because now, if you're working on a small case, that's easy. But if you're investigating a large case with many systems, with many users, it becomes very cumbersome to go back and redo all of these things. So sometimes you would spend a week to look into one user and the next week to look into another user. So, or sometimes simultaneously, because they might give you a server image where you have to dig in and find information about the groups, the user, the activities about the user. So we want to be more detail oriented. So as I say, in technical world, the more organized you are, right, the more detailed you are, the easier it is for you to operate for the task. So it's going to help us report from the notes that we're taking. Let me zoom in a little bit more. So it is at its best. Okay. So what are the elements that we need to include in our notes, right? What you have done something in the investigation. So when something was done in the investigation, when was this, right? Like, did you use a tool? Did you meet with someone to do an interview? Did you, so when you have an activity that relates to the investigation, you want to be able to include that in the notes. What was done in the investigation? So, the activities that you have done and the details in those activities, like performing scans, interviewing victims and witnesses, right? And then why did you do those things, right? There's a purpose in finding the answer or putting together a story for the investigation, right? So I would say that first, I want to be able to look into the image, right, to find out the identity of the victims and the suspects. So once that's done, I would then go and interview their family members to be able to find out more about, the events that happened for that day, if there was a crime that was committed, etc. Okay. So if you did something, explain why you did it. Why did I do an interview? Because I wanted to find more details about, occurrences that happened before the incident or even after the incident, right? And then what did you discover in the investigation? So like for today, if we're able to discover the identity of the drug dealer, we want to be able to state that. We want to be able to find the phone number for the supplier. So if you found that, you would be able to explain that. So this question usually gets answered later on, right? But these are the things that you would progress as you would investigate the case and you would take the notes. Okay. Also, why should you take photo and document the condition of your systems or your device that you're working with? To make sure that there is integrity in your investigation. There's also accountability, and we talked about, like, we want to be able to track like who accessed that system for the investigation and so on. So we want to have accountability of the investigator in the process. So if you begin your investigation, you would take a picture of the computer, the tablet, the phone, whichever system that the server that you are investigating. You want to put down the model number, right? The brand. Also the system information like processor capacity, like for the drive, especially if you're working with like devices, right? If it's an Android, what is the model of the Android? What is the memory storage? Because the storage contains data. And so on, right? If you know that if there's like a certain type of service that it used, you should also indicate that. But we want to take the photo and document the type of systems that we're working with. So this is gonna be expected for your project, right? You will be given a USB. And your goal is to find out the content of the USB, not by opening it, because if you open it, it would change the nature of the USB. But we want to maybe take a picture of it. We want to note the type of USB that we're working with, the capacity of the USB. Once we go through and scan it, it's going to tell you, right? And then we want to document the process that and the tools that we use to be able to discover the content of the USB, such as the software that you use, right? What did you find and how you found it. Okay. Okay, so if you are using the notes, you can refer to page 1. It talks about the elements of your notes, right? Digital photo, use a way to take notes, and then the next part is writing the report. So the report, you would see that there's different format in the way that the report, but what you want is you want the general content to be in there. So we want to have some administrative information, the company you work for, the agency, the case number, who's the investigator. So when you fill out the project information at the beginning, it plugs that into the digital report for you already, right? So take that information and put it on. Usually this is on the cover page of your report. So administrative information, like who's the investigator and which company they work for or agency they work for. And then if you have administrative content like search warrant or affidavit, that needs to be also included as an exhibit. So if that goes to court, this is the added document that would go following your case information. Then the next part, you are going to have an executive summary. So executive summary, some of you probably have known how to do this, but if you haven't, basically it's a brief description of what your case would be. I say brief, right? Your executive summary should not be lengthy. So it should only be at most 10% of your content of your report. So you want it to be short and clear, and you want to make sure that you have the same narrative timeline as what you would include in the report. I tend to write my executive summary last for most of the report that I submit, only because it should summarize what they are about to read. Okay, so the executive summary is to help prepare the reader for the detailed content inside your report. It should not include any information that is not on the narrative. So everything that you put on the executive summary should be relevant, and it should be from the narrative, from the inside the content of your report. It should also contain your conclusion and your finding. So basically it preview what they're about to read. Okay. And you need to target the non-technical user. Don't assume that the people who read your report knows the technical term, right? If you are investigating malware, you need to make sure that you define what malware is, because some people don't know what malware is, right? These days, some might, but not all, right? And then so anything that's technical, just gotta make sure that you have some kind of explanation or definition for those things. Okay, that helps us answer the next part. So why should you consider the type of audience to address? Why should you consider the type of audience to address the digital forensic report? To really emphasize the different technical levels and the details in the report. And so we want it to be easy to read for everyone. Okay? Because tends to be that the nature of this industry is we tend to be very technical, right? You might say a certain type of tool. You might say that the tool that you use is open source. you might assume that the people know what open source is and how to get those tools, right? So you want to be clear on, where did your tool come from? Was it tested? And how you use the tool, but you want it to be not as technical as if you were to convey that to a technical team. So the people that's going to read your report might be lawyers, judges, right? It might be like, the people that would determine the outcome of the case. It might be like the family members, etc. So we want to make sure that we are using our report to allow everybody to understand the content. Then what information should be included in the administrative section? Your case information, participants, investigators, suspects, victims, search authorities, warrants, affidavit, and a brief summary, which is your executive summary. And with that, we said that the executive summary should be high-level overview of what had occurred in the investigation. It should only be at most 10% of the actual report. And you want to include findings and conclusion, but not the entire narrative. You have access to AI now. AI is wonderful for that, right? If you have your report, you give it to AI and be able to convert that into an executive summary for you. But keep in mind that if you do this in the real world practice, if you use ChatGPT, your information is not private. If you are investigating the case, you are gonna sign some non-disclosure agreement and making sure that this is not disclosed to ChatGPT. So if you're using AI, you can use an app that is installed locally and it's not reporting your data to the data center of that AI. Okay. So there are AI that you can download and it's a standalone AI and you can use it that way. But so just be careful about that if you're using AI, right? AI can help you streamline a lot of process in this area, like, helping you clean up your writing, helping you reword and rephrase, giving you an executive summary and or finesse it and make it look nicer, etc. So, but just keep in mind that some organization will not allow you to integrate AI, especially things that are not standalone. So you just got to make sure that you clear it with them. And if you're able to use standalone AI, then you can, right? Because it's privacy issue. All right, so let's move 6 down to the next page and move this up a little. Okay, so then what should go into the body of your report, the entire narrative, the report or the technical section of the report? We want to make sure that it's non-biased and it should have non-technical details, like the artifacts that you examine and you found and you examined. So acquisition details is really about how you found the artifacts and what was found. Okay, so what did you find here and how you found it? And then the examined evidence, so the artifacts that you found is then either being used as an evidence or relate that to facts. So we would then explain how we analyze it and correlate and what that represents. So this area is like really going to be the forensic expertise area, but it's going to really tell the general audience on what did you find, how you found it, and how that relates to the case. So we want to state the item information. We want to have the step-by-step analysis. And if you come across problems right? Or issues in the analysis, you want to indicate that here. Keep in mind that you might not find everything that you need to find, right? And that's normal. It's okay. Sometimes we're unable to, for example, right, if there has been corrupted file and you're not able to recover those files, but you know that those files exist because your forensic toolkit tells you that these files were there, but it's not able to retrieve it. So you would state that in the issues of your analysis. You would also include a section for definition of your technical terms. So anything that would relate to things that has acronyms, we want to define what that is, right? Even though you deem that those things might be simple to you because you have technical knowledge. So just make sure that we define all the technical terms. And then we want to, if you are using digital evidence to identify physical person or subject the investigation, make sure that we chronologically present that. So timeline and you know, like we want to say so and so contact this phone number on this date. So the timestamp, right? And we, you know, throughout that contact, we can say the geolocation of this phone number was this coordinates, right? Which is going to be tied to the physical location. So you kind of have to go from how you tie the digital evidence into what you would be relating to the physical location and the physical person. The correlation is hard because the attorney, in the case if it's a court case, they might argue otherwise, right? And so, you know, we want to make sure that we represent the evidence in multiple ways. So that way it would truly identify that person. Okay. So if I have something that represents, like, for example, an x-ray of the individual with the name on it, right? That would really represent the individual because it's his x-ray. So what we would see is that we have, and can that be falsified, right? So we really have to relate that into the actual physical identity of the subject. And then we would have exhibits of artifacts and the analysis review. So if you chronologically display things like from the earliest to the latest based on the artifacts that you found, what you can do is you can explain, right, how each of the artifact that is discovered, like files, right, or images, or geolocation, or etc. That's going to tell the big picture of what happened in that case. And then at the end, you're going to have conclusive findings. So remember that we need to be non-biased. Okay. So what should you include as part of the analysis details in the report and then the narratives? Again, we want to state the device information, the ownership of the device, that's important. So if it's a company's provided device, we need to state that there. If it is personal device that the employee used and the artifacts is actually acquired from it, that's important because there's some privacy regulations that's going to restrict or allow us, right? And the ownership really ties back to, do we have the right to be able to, you know, correlate the evidence that we find from the personal device if they don't give us the permission to do that, right? And then the results, and also I suggest a lot of screen captures. That's gonna also help show as you tell in your narrative, right? And then your findings with the conclusion of the analysis. Okay, so typically we would have a glossary section in the report. This will include your terminology, your keywords, and then relevant page numbers. So once we have the document prepared, what you can do is you can put that into the PDF format only because um Adobe does have the way that you can sign it to make sure that there's integrity, so you can digitally sign it. I know Office 365 now has that capability, so you would be able to implement that for whichever software that you use to document. But in general, PDF is cross-platform. So if someone, and you can open it with the browser, right? Like I can view it if I don't have Adobe on my computer, and someone else can view it if they have the app on their computer. So either or, so you want to have a software that is capable of digital signature, and also it will be able to access. Now, not everybody have Microsoft Word, right? If I have an Apple system, I might, and I don't have Office 365 installed, I might not have access to that file. So you have to think about like an application that would work across different OSs, and it also have this integration. And so Adobe is probably ideal. Okay, so there's some example, so when you discover the evidence, like if you examine the artifacts, you have to spell out the file name, okay? Even if it's a long file name and they are specific. If there are 50 or 50,000 files, you have to include that list of files. As you can see in the example that's provided here, okay? And then it talks about how you would include some exhibit, making sure that it is provided to everybody so they can understand, including the jury, the judges, the attorney, and general people. I talk about including make and model and serial number for your systems, and you can have a table like this. Companies will use tag systems to be able to identify, because you might have like a bunch of desktop that are exactly the same in model, but we want to make sure that we use different tag to identify them separately. Okay. And then acquisition details. It talks about like the date that you acquired the hardware and the software. And then also in the analysis section, you want to provide like how you analyze. Okay. Now, when you include screenshot, just describe what it is, what you intending to tell with the screenshot. Okay. So when I read your project report, I will read it from a perspective that I know nothing technical, and I wanted to see if I can understand your report. Okay, so I suggest looking at the notes. It gives you some example. And then for your software that you use, the tools that you use, make sure that you put the brand of the software and the exact version of your software. Okay. And then your glossary, it talks about that in the question 9, and then question 10, it talks about that in the following section, which is the format. So our notes is not very long. It's like 6 pages. You can read through it quickly, and to refer to it. So just keep in mind that you can use this information and be able to apply this to your project report. Okay, I'll stop and then I'll take a